Hi, Misha here, and this at first might seem like a very eclectic, even random group of firearms to have on the table all at the same time. But there is a common thread. They were all produced by the same factory, or rather, at the same factory. Yeah, as the title of the video indicates, this is the history of the Simson Company, Simson Co., in Sulh, Germany. And if you don't recognize that name, maybe you will recognize the name BSW. Don't recognize that? How about the name Guslav Werke? No? How about the name Ernst Thälmann? Yeah, they went through a lot of changes and ownerships, and frankly, not very polite transfers. It was stolen more than once, so I thought it was interesting to talk about it from its original Jewish owned and operated roots in the 19th century, service to the to the Kaiser in the Great War, to the Weimar Republic and its rather interesting exclusivity agreement contract, to its seizure, to its second seizure after the war, and kind of what ended up happening to everything. So before we dive in talking about Simson, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to Patreon. Also, I have done an exclusive video looking at this little gun here because it is weird and rare enough that I thought it deserved it. With that, let's dive in. Simson Company began its major contracts for the German government with the good old Gewehr 98, the Model 98 Mauser, of course, during the Great War, World War I. But going back just a minute, into the 1850s, the original factory was established as essentially an ironworks by two brothers, Moses and Lub. My speech cannot read umlauts. Anyway, it actually says Lb, L-B. I'm sure you wanted to know that. They got into making gun barrels early on, which is actually an avenue a lot of the historic gun makers started off with. They also made bayonets and parts for bayonets, cleaning rods for guns, things like that. But by the late 1860s, they were starting to make full rifles, although it seems like it was mostly for more the commercial, the nobility market. And they were in the town of Sulh, which is kind of the central part of what would become unified Germany. And moving forward, there's a bit of a handing off, widows, changes, partners. 1884, the actual Simson Co. name is established, and from there it's owned by Moses' son, Moses Simson Jr., presumably, and he progresses it into the 20th century, and actually quite successfully. They were pretty early into the auto industry. They also do bikes, like pedal bikes, not motorcycles, this early on. And they do continue making sporting guns, mostly sporting shotguns like double barrels. And they were not one of the original manufacturers of the Gewehr 98. Early Model 98 production is actually quite fascinating. A lot of factories did shut down, and not many were making them when war was kicked off in 1914, but of course they would be brought online. Of course, this is 7.92 by 57, typical, turn bolt design. You're here, you know what these are, but double stack, double feed, internal mag, pretty much Paul Mauser's crowning achievement, roller coaster sights. This is an earlier one without the finger grooves and without the disassembly disc. These would, of course, change during the war. And beginning in 1915, you would have 4 state arsenals that would make these, and 7 private companies, including at least 4 in Sulh, Germany, in the region. And so Simson was just not only one of many, but actually one of several in its own city/region, and it was one of the smaller ones. So this is not a Simson-made gun. I mean, they made their fair share, but their output was relatively small compared to like Mauser, DWM, Erfurt, Hamburg, those kind of things. When the war was started, Germany had fewer than 2,300,000. Some of them quite old, even maybe not even chambered for the Spitzer round yet, so they had to be reworked. And by war's end, they had built roughly 7 million. So in there, they built a little under 5 million, 98 patterns during the war, and of those, Simson's would be just a fraction. And of course, they would stop manufacturing in 1918. And to be fair, the German government had slowed down or even stopped Gewehr 98 production in 1917, 1918, refocusing on MG08 machine guns and Luger pistols and even the new MP18 submachine gun, because they had plenty of these. It was a different time. And that could have been the end of it. Simson's contract was canceled, and they were just one of many small German arms factories in kind of the central part of Germany, Thuringia, that region, which is really how it's pretty interesting that became so important in the mid and late 1920s, their rise. Post-World War I, Treaty of Versailles put major limitations, major restrictions on Germany. The size of their military, and lots of strictures on their guns, like maximum barrel length. Really, it's like the National Firearms Act. But the only reason they let them have any kind of military at all is if they didn't, then France would have to protect them, or Britain, or America, or whoever, but probably France, because they're right there. So they needed to be able to protect themselves. Nevertheless, millions of guns were destroyed, and many were lost in the war to begin with. Many were worn out. Those that were still in good shape would get the rather famous 1920 date over the chamber area. Lugers, Mausers, what have you. That was a government property mark to show that it was official and not something that had walked home after the war. So not an illegal gun. And some, like this gun, were still around and still in good shape. But, well, they would need spare parts. Mags, toggles for Lugers, firing pins, and, for Gewehr 98s too, even though the number they could have these rifles was quite limited. So, around 1920, the Weimar Republic, the government, requested the Allied Disarmament Commission, the body in charge of, doing exactly what the name says on the tin. They requested them, hey, can we buy new parts? And maybe some fresh guns. And actually, they agreed. However, they would not let them reopen a government arsenal, say, at Erfurt, which had been making P08 Lugers like this. In fact, they made nearly 500,000 standard 08 models and, a much smaller number of artillery P14 models. Instead, they said, instead of a big old government state-owned arsenal, we're going to let you transfer production to a small private factory. So in the early 20s, they essentially held bids where companies could say, hey, how much will you charge to build new parabellum pistols? And multiple German companies put in their bids because, they weren't really allowed to make guns of any type for the government, and could only really make guns for export, foreign customers. And Simson Co. was one of them. Although they weren't super into it. They put in a bid, and maybe a little bit to their dismay, they were declared the winner. And it wasn't just to produce P08 pistols. It would actually be a contract to be the one authorized factory in Germany that could build guns, parts, what have you, for the government. So essentially there would be one private contractor. That's what the Allied Committee insisted upon, and Simson was the winner. So we see the transfer of the old Erfurt tooling, and presumably they still had some Gewehr 98 tooling from the war left, or easily got some. Again, lots of things were being dismantled, so why not? So you start to see more and more moving to Simson, still in the city of Sulh. And this is kind of the genesis of the problems. This is considered a state-owned material. It's being transferred by outside forces to a factory. And, well, if I'm being, probably more objective, I would say it's because Simson was a small factory, and therefore it just could not build all that many guns. But even in the 1920s, some more conspiracy-oriented news sources, and I use news in air quotes, in Weimar, Germany, were saying it was part of an international Jewish conspiracy, an international cabal, to have Simson as the sole maker, supplier, and by this point, it's actually under the ownership of the grandson, Arthur Simson. So, the first Luger contract. It took time to set up, move over, and officially in 1925, the government ordered 10,000 pistols. Just like this. I've seen sometimes the Simson guns called the Model 1926. It was just like a wartime gun, blued finish, wood grips. Could have a wood or an alloy base plate on the mag. I was actually going to put an alloy base plate mag in this, but I couldn't locate one real quick, so it's about the only difference. And the first year of production, they would actually date them, 1925, and they would start to do it the second year, 1926, and then very quickly stop. So only the first few hundred have a 4-digit year date. And Simson would use a factory symbol of kind of an S and a fancy triangle thing. Keep that in mind. So, S. And they were just like this with the essentially 4-inch barrel, 8-shot mag, 9mm parabellum, single action only, toggle system. It's a Luger. You get it. And they would hold the contract for a number of years, but it seems like production really was from 25 until the late 20s. And they would ultimately make just under 12,000, roughly 10,000 for the Army, and maybe a few would go to other branches, and then a couple of thousand for police or security, that kind of thing, a much smaller number. None of these were for export. None were for commercial sales. No, these were government contracted P08s. And they also, as I said earlier, made plenty of spare parts to keep older guns like this one up and running. So that kind of takes care of pistols. What about rifles? Well, here we come to the second kind of major Simson contract. The carbine. Doesn't it look like a carbine to you? Yeah. Also, one of my favorite Mauser variants, because I like the history behind it. Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles put pretty tight restrictions on long rifles. They were seen as kind of the primary deadly infantry weapon, but they were more forgiving of carbines. And Germany did have a much smaller number of Kar 98s, later to be reclassed as Kar 98A in 1923. But they got a little tricky here. So even early on, they were finding little tricky ways to circumvent little points of the Treaty of Versailles. And that's what we have here. And Simson was definitely complicit. After the Great War, efforts were underway in various nations, including Czechoslovakia, to kind of update and modernize the Model 98. As cool as the roller coaster sight was they would get rid of it. And so you do see some early efforts that are still marked Gewehr 98 in the early 20s in Germany, 23, even 24, where you essentially give a full rifle carbine features. You have side sling mounts, and you get rid of these sights and go to what they considered a carbine style rear sight, but it's just really a tangent rear sight. And of course we have a turn down bolt handle. But the early ones were still marked Gewehr 98. That would change though. In 1924, this pattern was pretty well standardized. And we would see a new naming convention come into play right here. In early 1925, the new name of Carab 98B would come into use. Now, this can be traced back to early as 1923 on paper, but the name on the guns would appear by government order by the beginning of 1925. So you can find some of these with Gewehr markings. It's a very interesting subject to me, just the transition. But how it applies to today is, again, Simson is the one official maker of weapons for the government. In November of that year, they're given a contract to produce 10,000 Carab 98Bs. They also refurbish and update older guns, because, I mean, really, it's just a restock, new sight. There's also the unofficial variant known as the Gewehr 98M or G98M that appears here. Again, it's very interesting to me. And so they start making these rifles that are on paper carbines and have the carbine features, but long barrel. I should point out that this whole concept of a side sling mount and turn down handle began for this rifle as for mounted troops early on. Now, I will also point out that DWM unofficially, and quite frankly, illegally, per international agreement, was doing some work. We don't know how much, but it doesn't seem like it was all done by Simson. But because DWM isn't supposed to be doing work except for international export sales, guns used by the German government will have the S mark for Simson. And we don't really know how many 98Bs were made, but I've seen the number of around 70,000, and production / remanufacturing seems to have lasted throughout the 20s and maybe into the very early 1930s. I want to make a short detour from Mausers and Lugers to talk about the Simson pocket pistols. Now, I've already done a full video on this one here. This is a model 1926, sometimes also called a model 1927. And really the only other pocket pistol that was produced in any numbers at all, meaning a couple of thousand, was the model 1922, which was essentially the same, just a little bit more fancy. But even these, they only made about 16, 18,000, maybe 20 on the outside. And this is unique because it is a design that seems to be wholly from the Simson factory, whereas most of what they did was producing, other things. Of course, this is a 6.35 millimeter striker-fired, single-action, blowback, magazine fed. I believe it's a 6-round mag. It's about a 4.5-inch gun, little gun. And it's kind of interesting. There were two big production runs. They built about 2,200 of the original 1922. Then they switched over to the updated 1926 here, and they built about a little under 3,000 more. Then they stopped for a while. Then they picked back up around serial number 20,000 and ran through about 35,000, by which time the company was under new management, much for the worse, but we'll get to that in a second. It was a commercial success for them. It was considered quite a well-made little gun. And the whole idea, it was meant to be easier to disassemble, maintain, take it apart here if I can, than previous like Browning models. And I think it is. The disassembly is very modern style. Your strikers in the back and your barrel and spring are a piece that come out together. You actually pull your barrel out. Again, done a full video on it if you would like to check that out. It is one of the few true Simson handgun products. Although, as I said earlier, they definitely did do some... sorry, there's a little catch there to overcome. They did do some sporting shotguns and whatnot, but even a lot of those were kind of copies of other things. I should add that within Germany, sometimes the Model 1922 was known as the Model 1, and the Model 1926 was known as the Model 2. And for many, many years, it was their only pistol, and really their only truly unique design under the Simson brand. Anyway, with a reasonably good, successful vest pocket under their belt and on the market, and with 2 successful contracts here, by 1927-28, Simson, well, they're becoming a very powerful firearms player, especially in the Thuringia region. And this would actually lead to another contract for another $10,000, but this would be new barrels and also refurbishment replacement work on some MP-18 submachine guns. And this actually came after an interesting course correction that the German government did in 1927-28. Originally, they looked to replace the P08 Luger, and Simson would actually make a test pistol, a 9x19 Parabellum, based on their vest pocket, but majorly scaled up, is still a blowback gun that I've seen referred to sometimes as the Model 1929, although I have to wonder if sometimes it was also called the Model 3. Either way, it didn't go much of anywhere because they refocused. They didn't ever fund trials, testing. Instead, they refocused on some machine guns and, to a lesser extent, machine guns. And Simson would also get a piece of that pie, refurbishing, repairing some old MG08s. I just thought I'd mention the Trials 9mm because I find direct blowback 9mm fascinating. So now we have more contracts under their belt, and as we roll into 1930, yeah, things are looking good, but 2 problems. One, other manufacturers, especially in their region, but even across Germany, are becoming envious, especially because their position as sole supplier, well, it's really enforced from without. And 2, a little-known party called the Nazis are gaining more and more authority. When things started to turn for Simson, Co., and Arthur himself, they turned very, very quickly. In fact, pretty much immediately after Hitler took office in 1933, Fritz Walther, but many others too, signed essentially a pact of other gun makers complaining that Simson had an unfair advantage, an unfair monopoly. I'm not going to say they were without basis given the Treaty of Versailles. However, any talk, especially in the news, of a Jewish conspiracy to prop them up was unfounded, to say the least. But that wasn't going to stop anyone. The governor of Thuringia, Fritz Sauckel, immediately launched an investigation of the Simson factory, and again, Arthur, a little bit of his family, pretty much anyone and everyone, and essentially halted production. Of course, all contracts were canceled. By 1934, it's already not good. And would you believe that Sauckel could not find any actual evidence of collusion, an international Jewish conspiracy, or really any wrongdoing of note of any sort? But again, nationalists, Nazis involved, that wasn't going to stop anything. So Arthur was put in jail for over half a year. Why? Why not? And of course, this would suspend operations at the factory. Other members of the board were also jailed or threatened, even some of the family. Essentially, 1935, Sauckel blackmailed Arthur Simson into signing a confession of not paying his income tax. I'm telling you guys, the IRS is the one thing you don't mess with. It also coerced him to handing over the factory to the government, to the state. So he lost his factory. The alternative was he was going to go back into jail. At this time, 1935, though, leading into 36, the Nazis didn't have a stranglehold quite yet. So Arthur would actually not go back to jail, even if he lost his factory, considering what could have happened later. Not a bad outcome. And within a year, he would immigrate over to Switzerland, and from there eventually make his way to the USA later on. But what about his factory? Well, back to Luger's, because rather famously, the tooling at Simson was given to what we would know as Krieghoff. And they would set up. Now, keep in mind, this is old third-hand tooling now. It was Erfurt and Simson. So a lot of it was worn out, dated. But Krieghoff could use it to set up their own P08 production line. So by 1935, they were producing their pistols with their first major contract for about 4,300 to the Luftwaffe. And they would continue to produce them into 36, filling out another contract much smaller, under 1,000 for them. And between that time and around 1943-44, they would build another few thousand. Interestingly, they would build more than Simson would. Like I said, Simson would build under 12,000. Krieghoff would build about 13,500, give or take, over the years. Although I have to wonder if there were plans to do more. These are steeped in the Nazi good old boy network. But of course, Mauser was on the move too. Of course, the Carabiner 98K would be adopted and is rather famously known. In 1934, they would make guns with the K code. In 1935, the G code. And then by 1936, German factories would abandon the pretense and just start putting date codes. But what's interesting about both Krieghoff and Mauser, they would use the S to kind of sort of say they're Simson, but also if they were ever called out, they had an excuse saying, oh no, that's not Simson. It was kind of a thing. So this is where the S42 code used by Mauser up until around 1938-39 appears. Krieghoff too used the S code. Several other factories, J.P. Sauer, which was also in Sulh. Hanel was still around. So you see all this stuff happening. And they're all using the guise of being Simson up until at least the Olympics of 1936. But by this point, the Nazis have established their power, so it's actually very good that Arthur got out when he did. Now let's talk Gewehr 43s. Remember Governor Sauckel? Well, he was about as Nazi gets. And he would very quickly rename the Simson factory to BSW, essentially Berlin Suhler Waffen. And they would actually continue producing some commercial goods, automobile things, actually one of the first motorcycles for a minute. But very soon they would get into the firearms business. Now, this is not one of theirs. They're actually quite rare. And if you don't know that name, BSW, you probably do know the name Gustloff. The name was changed, or at least added on to, in 1939 after Wilhelm Gustloff, who was assassinated back in 36. He was another ardent Nazi and became a hero of the party, a martyr, what have you. So the Simson factory is now bearing the name of an ardent Nazi, a process that they referred to as Aryanization. because that's a real word. After Sauckel nationalized and Aryanized the company, it would continue making firearms, including the 1926 we looked at earlier, under the new BSW brand. I don't think many were made. This one here by its serial is kind of second half of production, not too late, but not early at all. And some were made, including like Nazi party versions, which is kind of funny, all things considered. But manufacturing seems to have ceased by 1939. Maybe some were still put together at the early part of World War II, just from leftover parts. But, you know, by that point, it was under new orders for new guns, which, yeah, we'll get to. But this was a pretty unique interwar offering from them, and one of their very few commercial offerings, because most of what Simson did was for the Weimar Republic, the government. In fact, nearly 70% of what they bought firearms-wise was from the Simson company. Of course, to some extent, they didn't have a choice because of the Allied Disarmament Committee's ruling, but hey-ho. But with that, let's move forward. Early on, the factory's contributions to the war were motorcycles, actual bikes, auto parts. They would also make AA guns and eventually the MG-42, which was kind of the key piece on the infantry side. But then the Germans would meet the Russians and meet the SVT-40. That would spur on the Gewehr 41, which Gustav would not make. They would be using the code BCD. They would get away from the old number codes. And from there, you would get the Gewehr 43, which was essentially a Gewehr 41 with a SVT-40 gas system, short-stroke piston in it. And now, Gustav BCD would make these. And good old Sauckel is still kind of around, at least in a supervisual row. This is, of course, a Walther. Production was ordered in October of 1943. Only a couple of thousand were built that year. And it was also set up at BLM, who had made the G41. And then a new factory, well, BCD, Gustav Werke. Now, they were still in Sulh, but by this point, the war's not going good, and workers are hard to find. So Sauckel arranges for slave labor from the Buchenwald concentration camp to supplement the workforce at the former Simson BSW Gustav BCD factory. And they would be producing these by 1944. And they would be this style, including with the threaded barrel. They would have a blued finish, a laminated beechwood stock. Interestingly, they would not make their own receivers. Now, Walther would use forged receivers some of the time, but they would actually use traditional machined milled receivers that were subcontracted out to MAS or Saint Etienne in France. So they would actually use French receivers and a lot of Walther parts, especially early on as they were getting up and running in 1944. But it would be a very short run. In fact, by far the smallest production. Of the over 400,000 Gewehr 43s, later K43s, built, less than 50,000, somewhere between 43 and 47,000, came from BCD factory. And the reason is, in August of 1944, really right as they were getting up on the manufacturing, they were hit by a major bombing raid, Allied raid, and it really, really severely crippled their production capacity. And this on top of the fact that because of slave labor, I know this is shocking, quality was horrible. Sabotage was rampant. QC was terrible. Yeah, they're kind of known as the lowest quality of the three makers. Of course, they're desirable today just because of being rare, but yeah, In fact, a lot of them didn't even have the scope rail on the side. It was machined off. They never made a sniper because of quality. But I just had to mention that this factory, at least under a couple of different names, made these for about half a year during World War II, alongside some other guns, which, no, I don't have an MG42 to show you, sorry. And, like I said, their P08 tooling had been moved again and essentially cannibalized for Krieghoff. And that gets us really to the end of the Second World War. Much like the Karl Walther factory in Zalamallis, the Gustloff factory, the former Simson factory in Sulh, found itself in the Soviet zone of occupation, which is why our third section features Soviet-style guns. But before we go there, whatever happened to Fritz Sauckel, and for that matter, Arthur Simson? Well, one lived for several more decades and had a family and at least regained some reparations for their business. The other was hung in 1946 for war crimes. Guess which was which? Am I cheating a little bit by including an MPI KM and a Makarov M in a Simson video? Kinda, but we're gonna go with it. Like I said, it was in the Soviet zone of occupation, and after the war, they considered just kind of demolishing. It seems like what was left after the bombing raids and the war really had more to do with the automotive production side and less to do with the firearms. So what Russia would end up doing was taking thousands of machines and just calling them war reparations and using them to make bikes and motorcycles and automobiles in Russia. And to be fair, Russia needed all the help in manufacturing automobiles they could get. So they essentially stripped the buildings in Sulh bare. But the factory was still there, and I rhymed. Huzzah. But it wouldn't be long before the Simson name would reappear in the 1950s. Some sources say 52, some say 55. Either way, the Simson brand name is brought back by the DDR under, of course, Soviet control. And they use it mostly to make mopeds, motorcycles, things of that nature. Actually, some very successful ones, including some racing vehicles and things. So it becomes more of an automobile name. So why bring these out? Well, the original AKs in East Germany were developed at the Weisse factory, but they would be produced at Ernst Thälmann in Sulh. Ditto for their Makarov, which they called the Pistol M. They would start making AKs in 58, low rate for the milled, but not really ramp up till 60, 61, even 62. Makarovs followed a very similar path, low rate in 58, 59, some experimentation with production. And by 1960, they were hitting peak production. And they would keep making these until about 1965, at least mainline. And of course, they would switch over from the milled to the stamped between 1964 and 1966 here. And recently covered that in a very long video, so we're not going to really talk about that. In addition to essentially being in the same city, and since it's all state-owned at this point anyway under VEBS, the whole constructive thing, it was made official by 1968, where the Simson brand and factory was just rolled into the whole Ernst Thälmann thing, and therefore they were part of the overall complex, making Kalashnikovs and refurbishing military guns. And it gets, when the state owns things and there's no real private ownership, it doesn't really matter. But the factory is still there, the facilities are still there, and kind of part of the whole thing in the 1960s with Ernst Thälmann, even using a lot of the same codes and overall this kind of communist manufacturing things. But it actually gets a little more interesting, especially because of the pistols. We never did get a semi-automatic AK out of East Germany, so they're all kit builds. So you could argue, well, there's really no direct connection with Simson, and okay, fair, fine, whatever. However, not so with the pistols. While this one here is a 60s production, military or police, and was made under the Ernst Thälmann conglomerate name. The Simson brand was still pretty popular throughout the 70s and 80s, being one of the better makers of auto things, again, mostly motorcycles, racing bikes, that kind of thing. So after reunification, there was a lot of effort put into keeping it alive, trying to rehabilitate it, update it, modernize it. Not uncommon. Even in the West, lots of factories like SIG and IMI were having to restructure post-Cold War. Well, one of the ideas was to offer Makarovs, and these would actually be sold around 1995 under the Simson and Sulh brand name. And these would be German, not East German Makarovs, meaning that, yes, unified Germany is technically one of the only nations, one of 5, to make true Makarov PMs. Now, to be fair, they were really mostly disassembled from leftover spare surplus parts, although I'm sure some new manufacturing was done. And to be fair, they only brought over roughly 1,000, maybe a few more, making them quite rare. But there are Simson labeled Makarovs, which I think is cool. They even made one small mechanical change. So here's a standard, like I said, military one. I'm going to retract the slide. But when your safety's on, your side is locked for, well, safety. With the Simson guns, that was actually changed. You could actually rack the slide. It would still decock with the safety on. This is actually a feature you see in a lot of Walther pistols, so makes perfect sense. I should also point out that the whole 9x18 cartridge was inspired by World War II German 9x18 Ultra / Police and the whole thing, but that's a story for another day. But I just had to mention the end with this pistol because technically a Makarov was one of the very final Simson branded products. And there is a pretty definitive end. Despite attempts to keep the brand going, update it, modernize it, introduce new products, again, mostly auto stuff, but, firearms too. By 2002, they just weren't able to keep up, and so production was suspended. They were losing money, and so it was officially defunct, bankrupt by early 2003. So that was it. So finally, after 150 years, it was over. And many captures and name changes too. But at least Arthur Simson did live until 1969 and was even given some small reparations for having his factory essentially stolen from him. Yeah, hey. Better than Fritz Sauckel's fate. And they were part of the East German complex and all that good stuff besides. So what do you think? Let's wrap this up. So, we end. It's a bit of the company, the factory of Theseus, because it changed. Tooling was removed, brought over from elsewhere, taken around. Ownership changed around and around and around. Interestingly, the name lasted in some form or another well into the Cold War era. And from what I've gathered, it's pretty famous in the world of motorcycles, bikes, that kind of thing. Also automobiles. But we're here focusing on firearms. So what do you think? Totally different company? Or was it kind of the same from the early to the changeover with the Erfurt tooling to when it was seized by Sauckel, then the Nazis, and Aryanized, and then, of course, seized again, although plundered before going back in business as Ernst Thälmann for producing guns like these in the 1960s. I thought it was a story worth telling. I hope you agree. Sorry if it was boring. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, because we have individual videos on pretty much every one of these guns, check out the link to Patreon. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.